The lantern light flickered against the rough timber walls of the barn, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of secrets from another time. Outside, the prairie wind carried with it the scent of hay, dust, and wood smoke from chimneys dotting the small village that clung stubbornly to life on the edge of the frontier. It was the late 1800s, when every town had its share of legends and every face carried a story carved by hardship and grit. In a place where lawmen rode in once a month, if that, and where justice often came from the barrel of a gun, folks learned to make their own rules. And tonight, in that creaking barn, the cowboy found out he wasn't the only one who knew how to draw a hard line. He leaned against the stall door, hat low over his eyes, a cigarette glowing faint in the corner of his mouth. The air was thick with dust, quiet save for the restless shifting of horses. The cowboy had spent most of his life on the trail, moving cattle, dodging bandits, keeping to himself. He'd never been the kind to look for trouble. Trouble, however, had a way of finding him. And on this particular night, trouble wore boots that clicked against the barn floor and voices that carried a chill sharper than any desert wind. The village had always whispered about them, the sisters. No one could quite say how many there were or where they had come from. Some swore they were orphans who had raised each other on the outskirts of town after a fire took their homestead. Others claimed they were the daughters of a gunslinger long buried under prairie dirt. Whatever the truth, their presence unsettled the townsfolk. They kept together, moved like a single unit, and had a knack for showing up exactly where folks least wanted them. Rumor held they'd run gamblers out of town, sent a gang of drifters fleeing into the hills, and more than once stood face to face with men who underestimated them, men who didn't linger long afterward to tell the tale. The cowboy had heard of them before, of course. Everyone had. But hearing of them and facing them were two different things. The barn door creaked wider, lantern light spilling brighter as shadows lengthened. Boots scraped. A laugh low and knowing echoed. Then another. Soon the barn was filled with their presence, a circle tightening around him like a noose. He could feel the weight of their eyes even before he lifted his head to meet them. The sisters weren't alike in looks. Not exactly, though something in their sharp gazes bound them tighter than blood. One carried herself with the cool authority of someone used to giving orders. Another leaned casual against a support beam, twirling a strand of straw between her fingers, her smirk daring him to flinch. A third stood stiff and silent, her stare colder than the metal barrel of a rifle. The others fanned out, shifting with the same rhythm as if they had rehearsed this moment. The air between them and the cowboy grew heavy, thick with the kind of tension that made horses snort nervously in their stalls. "You think you can handle us all?" one of them asked, her tone more statement than question. The words hung in the air, daring him to answer. He didn't move, didn't blink. Out. Here, hesitation could cost a man more than pride. He remembered the whispers in town earlier that day. Folks had said the sisters were angry. Something had been taken from them or someone. They had been seen riding fast across the ridge, eyes set hard, hands never far from their belts. The villagers knew better than to get in their way. But the cowboy had a different problem. He hadn't gone looking for their quarrel, yet somehow it had found him anyway. Maybe it was bad luck. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe the sisters simply decided he was the man they needed to corner. The barn smelled of old hay and horse sweat, but beneath it, a sharper note filled the air, the tension of something about to snap. The cowboy's hand brushed the edge of his holster, not enough to draw, just enough to remind them he wasn't defenseless. Still, he wasn't fool enough to think speed alone would save him. Not with 6 pairs of eyes locked on him, not with the barn door barred shut behind them. Didn't look like killers. That was the unsettling part. Their clothes were plain, worn like anyone else's, and their hands were steady but not cruel. Yet there was a sharpness to them, a certainty that unsettled more than any drawn pistol. They had come for something, and the cowboy knew it wasn't going to be as simple as answering a question or handing over a coin. No, this was bigger, older, rooted deep in whatever history bound the sisters to this land, to each other, and now to him. He thought of the road that brought him here, the miles of dust and loneliness, the silent stars above endless plains. He'd seen outlaws hang for less, seen men shot down in saloons for words spoken too loud. But never had he seen anything quite like this 6 women closing in, not with wild fury, but with measured intent. Their silence as dangerous as a cocked revolver. The horses stamped nervously again, picking up on the unease. A gust of wind rattled the barn walls. The lantern flame bent low, shadows stretching like fingers. One of the sisters stepped closer, the boards groaning beneath her boots. Her eyes never left his. Her words were quiet, but they cut clean. You've got something of ours, and we aim to take it back. The cowboy felt the weight of the revolver at his side, but for the first time, he wasn't sure it would matter. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, he stood in the middle of that barn with nothing but silence pressing in on him. His cigarette burned down, ash dropping to the floor. The moment stretched long, taut as wire. The sisters waited, poised, their patience. Sharper than steel dot, and in that silence, with the night pressing hard against the barn walls, the cowboy realized something. Whatever came next would change everything. Whether he drew his gun, spoke his piece, or held his ground, the balance of power in that dusty old village was about to shift forever. The question was simple, brutal, and inescapable. Did he truly think he could handle them all? The sisters closed the circle tighter, their shadows blotting out the lantern light, until the cowboy's world was nothing but their eyes and the sound of their boots on the wooden floor. And then, just as one of them reached for his arm, the barn door creaked again, letting in a gust of cold night air and the outline of another figure. The cowboy's breath caught. The sisters turned in unison. Whatever had just walked in changed the game entirely. The barn held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The figure stood framed in the doorway, the night at their back, cold air sweeping through the barn and making the lantern flame dance. For a moment no one moved. The sisters, all sharp-eyed and steady, turned as one to face the newcomer. The cowboy felt the shift in the air like a weight being dragged across his chest. He had been cornered, and now something else had entered the circle. Whether it was friend or foe, he couldn't yet tell. The only thing he knew was that nothing about this night was going to end simple. The figure stepped inside, the sound of boots slow, deliberate, heavy with meaning. The light caught the edge of a coat, worn and dusty from the trail, and a hat pulled low over the face. The cowboy strained to see, but the shadows clung stubbornly, refusing to reveal more than an outline. The sisters exchanged glances, brief, but telling, like silent signals between soldiers who had fought side by side. They knew this person, or at least recognized something about the presence. The air grew even tighter, as if the barn walls had leaned inward. The cowboy's thoughts turned back to the whispers he'd overheard in town. The talk of the sisters riding hard after sunset, the talk of something taken. Folks had mentioned a name muttered low, but he hadn't caught it all. Now, with the figure stepping deeper into the barn, he began to wonder if this was tied to that same story. Perhaps the missing piece of their mystery had just walked in. One of the sisters finally spoke, her voice level but edged like sharpened steel. You came. She didn't raise her tone, but every syllable carried the weight of unspoken history. The others shifted slightly, their boots scraping the boards, not breaking their line but adjusting as though preparing for whatever was about to unfold. The cowboy could see the tension in their shoulders, the readiness in their stance. These weren't women surprised. They were braced for something they had expected all along. The figure's answer was quiet, almost swallowed by the restless sound of horses shifting in their stalls. "I told you I would." The voice was low, familiar to some ears in the barn, but not to the cowboy. It held the gravel of long roads and the weary authority of someone who had lived more than their share of harsh days. It wasn't the voice of a stranger wandering into trouble by accident. No, this was someone tangled deep in whatever web had caught the sisters. The cowboy shifted slightly, his boot nudging the straw. He wasn't sure if he was part of this play or just a bystander unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong hour. Still, every glance from the sisters suggested otherwise. They had chosen him to stand here, and now they had someone else to add to the mix. That meant the story wasn't just theirs anymore, it was his too. The barn seemed to shrink with every breath. The lantern popped, sending a spark against the iron hook above. The sisters drew closer together, as if forming a wall between the cowboy and the figure now inside. He could see it clearer now, broad shoulders beneath the trail coat, a hand that hung near the belt but never quite touched it. This person didn't need to move fast. They carried the kind of presence that made speed unnecessary. Authority clung to them like dust to leather. The cowboy remembered the first time he'd heard the name of the sisters whispered in a saloon 2 towns over. Men had lowered their voices, eyes darting to see if anyone was listening, before speaking of the strange unity the sisters carried. He'd laughed it off and chalking it up to prairie tales. But now, standing in the barn with them surrounding him, he felt the truth of it. They weren't just women who had learned to fend for themselves. They were something more and unbroken, chain, unyielding, and dangerous in their togetherness. And the figure who had just arrived was clearly the other half of whatever story bound them. Silent Sister, the one who hadn't spoken a word since stepping into the barn, finally shifted her gaze to the cowboy. For the first time he felt the full weight of it, as though she were measuring his worth. He almost looked away, but pride held him steady. Out here, a man didn't survive by flinching. Still, the message was clear. He was involved whether he liked it or not. His fate had been sealed the moment they had surrounded him. The figure stepped further into the light, enough that the cowboy caught the outline of a scar running along the jaw. It was old, healed but visible, the kind earned in a fight that could have gone either way. The sisters' leader tilted her chin, her tone steady. "We warned you. We told you there'd be a reckoning." The figure didn't flinch. The cowboy caught something in the eyes, calm, almost resigned, as though this night had been long expected. He wondered then if he was the only one caught by surprise. The horses stomped again, tails swishing, uneasy with the press of tension. The barn smelled of sweat, old hay, and the faint iron tang of something sharper, though no blood had been spilled. Not yet. The cowboy felt the weight of his revolver at his side again, but it seemed smaller now, almost useless against the storm building around him. This wasn't just about steel and bullets. This was about something older, deeper, the kind of feud that didn't stop with a single shot. The figure's voice cut through the silence once more. "You think he knows?" The words sent a ripple through the sisters. The cowboy's pulse thudded, realizing they were speaking of him. He wanted to ask, to demand what it was he was supposed to know, but his throat stayed dry. One of the sisters gave a short, sharp laugh. "If he doesn't, he will soon enough." The cowboy's mind spun, trying to piece together the fragments. Something stolen, something owed, a bond between the sisters and this scarred figure who now stood against them, and in the middle of it all him. Why? He had no claim, no tie to their feud. At least, not one he was aware of. Yet here he was, caught like a steer in a corral, every exit blocked. The night outside was quiet, the prairie stretched vast and endless, stars bright in the clear sky. Inside the barn, The world had shrunk to shadows, to boots on wood, to breaths drawn sharp. The cowboy thought of the village just beyond the saloon with its crooked sign, the blacksmith's forge still glowing from the day's work, the church steeple standing stubborn against the horizon. Folks there were likely sleeping, unaware of the storm brewing in this barn. Tomorrow they'd wake to whispers, to stories retold in low voices. But tonight, only those inside would know the truth of what was happening. The sisters closed the gap tighter, their boots moving in unison. The figure didn't retreat. The cowboy found himself holding his breath, waiting for the clash that seemed inevitable. Yet no one drew, no one struck. The suspense was worse than any gunfire. It was as though the air itself was daring someone to make the first move. The cowboy's mind turned over one thought again and again. Whatever secret they carried, whatever truth tied them together, it was bound to come crashing into his world before the night was through. And when it did, he doubted he'd leave the barn the same man who had walked in. The lantern hissed, the shadows stretched, and the night deepened around them. The figure's eyes met the sisters' leader one last time before glancing toward the cowboy. A question lived in that look, one that chilled him to his core. He didn't know the answer, not yet. But he knew he'd have to give one before long. The barn held its silence, the storm still gathering, waiting for the strike. Silence in the barn pressed heavier with each passing second, as if the night itself held its breath. The cowboy stood rooted in place, his hand grazing the edge of his holster, though he knew better than to draw. The sisters, sharp-eyed and unyielding, had already made it plain that steel alone wouldn't settle this. And the figure who had entered, the one with the scarred jaw and a weary coat, stood in the half-light, calm in a way that was far more dangerous than a drawn pistol. The cowboy's instincts screamed that he was standing in the middle of a story much older than himself, a story that had been waiting for this night to unfold. The sisters didn't rush. They shifted slightly, their boots whispering against the barn floor, adjusting their line until the circle around the cowboy and the newcomer closed even tighter. Their leader's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "You've got debts left unpaid, and we're here to collect." She wasn't looking at the cowboy when she spoke. Her eyes were fixed on the figure. Yet the cowboy felt the words land on him too, as though he'd been included in that reckoning without ever having asked for it. The figure's reply was slow, steady, filled with a kind of grim patience. "And I told you, there are things that can't be returned." That single sentence sent a ripple through the sisters, a stiffness in their shoulders, a tension in their jaws. One of them, the one who had smirked earlier, twirling straw, stepped forward, her gaze darting briefly to the cowboy before settling back on the scarred stranger. "Then we take what's left, and maybe he's part of it." The cowboy's chest tightened. He wanted to demand an explanation, to force the truth out of their mouths, but the weight of the moment pinned him silent. He thought back to the days leading up to this night, the whispers in the saloon, the way the villagers looked over their shoulders when the sisters rode through town. He'd heard fragments, something about land, something about betrayal, something about an oath made long ago. But no one dared speak the full story aloud. Maybe they feared it, or maybe they simply didn't know. Now, standing in this barn, the cowboy realized the story was no ghost tale. It was alive, breathing, and it had chosen him as witness. Figure's scar caught the lantern light again, and the cowboy saw the weariness behind it, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a burden too long. "This isn't his fight," the figure said, tilting their chins slightly toward the teal. "Cowboy." But the sisters didn't move. Their leader's tone hardened. "It is now. You brought him into it the moment you walked through that door." The cowboy swallowed hard, dust dry in his throat. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had come to this small village looking for a quiet stretch of work-mending fences, breaking horses, maybe a drink or two at the saloon to pass the lonely nights. Yet here he was, cornered in his own barn by 6 women whose eyes burned with purpose, and a scarred figure whose past had spilled over into his present. He wondered, briefly, if fate had simply chosen him as the fool to stand in the wrong place at the wrong time. A horse snorted sharply, kicking at its stall as though sensing the storm in the room. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing wild across the walls. The sisters shifted again, and for the first time, the cowboy noticed the small differences in them. The leader stood tall, unbending, every word calculated. The silent one was unreadable, her stillness carrying more threat than words ever could. The smirking one hid her fire behind a crooked grin. Another leaned on her instincts, scanning the barn as though expecting danger from every corner. Each of them carried their role like pieces of a single weapon forged together. They weren't just siblings, they were a force, bound by something no outsider could easily understand. The figure turned slightly, enough to face the cowboy for the first time. Their eyes were steady, filled with a question unspoken. The cowboy felt the weight of it and almost broke under it. What did they expect him to do? To choose a side? To fight? To flee? He had no answers, only the sense that whichever way he moved, he would be caught in the storm. The sisters' leader took a step closer, boots echoing against the planks. "We've lost enough," she said, her voice tightening, though it did not break. "We won't lose again, not to you. Not to anyone." The figure didn't flinch, but the cowboy caught the faintest sign, a shift of the jaw, a tightening of the hand that revealed the words had cut deeper than the stranger wanted to show. The cowboy's mind churned, trying to pull sense from the puzzle. What had been lost? What tied the sisters and this figure together? And what in all of it connected back to him? He thought of the land he'd ridden through earlier that day, the empty homestead on the edge of the prairie, charred, timbers still jutting like bones from the earth. He had passed it without thought, but now a suspicion stirred. Perhaps that ruin wasn't just another forgotten tragedy. Perhaps it was the heart of whatever bound these people to this night. The smirking sister spoke again, her grin fading into something sharper. "He doesn't know," she said, nodding toward the cowboy. "Not yet, but maybe he should. Maybe he deserves to know why he's standing in the middle of this." The others didn't argue, though their silence held. "Wait." The cowboy braced himself, though he wasn't sure if he wanted the truth or feared it. The barn door rattled suddenly with a gust of wind, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. Everyone flinched, even the silent sister, though her face betrayed nothing. The cowboy's hand twitched closer to his revolver. For a heartbeat. He thought the storm had broken, but no one drew. No one fired. Instead, the tension stretched tighter, as though the barn itself strained to hold it all. The cowboy's mind drifted to the village, to the people who would wake tomorrow with no idea of the storm at their doorstep. The saloon keeper wiping glasses, the blacksmith hammering iron, children chasing each other across the dusty street. They would never guess that in one lonely barn on the edge of town, 6 sisters and a scarred figure had gathered, dragging an unwilling cowboy into their feud. The thought chilled him, because he knew before long, the rest of the town would feel the weight of this story too. The sisters' leader spoke again, her words low but fierce. "You know what you took, and you know we'll stop at nothing to get it back." The figure's eyes flickered, a rare crack in their calm. The cowboy saw it, the guilt, the sorrow buried deep but not gone. It was true then. Something had been taken. Something that bound all of them here. But what? Land? Blood? A life? The cowboy didn't know. Yet he knew one thing for certain. Before the night was done, he would have no choice but to learn. Lantern hissed again, its flame shrinking low, as though even the light didn't dare intrude. The horses stamped nervously. their bodies shifting in the stalls. The cowboy felt the walls closing in tighter. His choices, already thin, were vanishing altogether. He was part of this now, whether he wanted it or not. The sisters' eyes were fixed, the figure's presence unshaken, and the night stretched on, waiting for the spark that would ignite it all. And as the barn trembled under the weight of secrets, the cowboy realized the cruel truth. Sometimes the past doesn't ask permission before it drags you under. Sometimes it simply chooses you, and once it does, there's no turning back. The cowboy's chest rose and fell slow, every breath heavy with dust and dread. The barn felt smaller than ever, as if the wooden beams themselves were leaning inward, straining under the weight of all that silence. He could feel the eyes of the sisters locked on him, sharp as knife points, and the scarred figure's presence pressing close behind him. No one had moved for what felt like forever, yet the air was alive, humming with the kind of tension that only needed one spark to set the whole place aflame. The leader of the sisters stepped forward until the boards groaned beneath her boots. The lantern light caught her face, stern and unyielding, and for the first time the cowboy thought he saw not just anger, but grief carved into her features. Her voice was low, almost steady, but it carried more fire than a gunshot. "You think the past can be buried," she said to the scarred figure, "but the prairie remembers. The land remembers, and so do we." The words were like stones dropped into a still pond, each one sending ripples through the sisters as they shifted their weight, their gazes hardening. The figure stood silent, unmoving, the scar along the jawline catching the dim glow. The cowboy thought they might speak, but instead the silence dragged on. He wondered if the scar carried more than a wound from some old fight, if it was a mark of whatever history bound these people together. The sisters' unity, their anger, and the figure's stillness told him this wasn't some quarrel over cattle or coins. This was deeper, something buried like a thorn that festered for years, now clawing its way to the surface. One of the sisters, the smirking one, let the grin slip at last. Her words cut sharp. "Tell him. Tell the cowboy why he's here, why you dragged him into it." She flicked her eyes at him, and he felt pinned in place like a horse under the lash of a whip. His mouth was dry, his hands clenched at his sides. But he stayed silent, waiting for someone to speak the truth. Yet the figure only shifted their weight, a shadow passing over their face, as though torn between confession and denial. The cowboy's thoughts churned with every whisper he'd overheard in town-burned land, broken promises, a family driven off their homestead. He remembered the charred ruins he had passed that morning, black timber stabbing the sky like bones. He hadn't thought twice about it then. Now it loomed in his mind, a silent witness to whatever truth hung over this barn. He felt his stomach tighten as suspicion grew that the ruin was tied to the sisters and to the scarred figure who carried their rage in silence. The horses grew restless, hooves thudding against the wooden stalls, their nostrils flaring at the sharp edge in the air. The cowboy felt the urge to move, to break free from this circle, but every instinct warned him that any sudden step would snap the fragile thread holding this standoff together. He had seen gunfights before, enough to know that hesitation killed a man as quick as lead. But this was worse. No one had drawn, yet it felt more dangerous than the fastest duel he'd ever laid eyes on. The silent sister finally stirred, her gaze sweeping from the figure to the cowboy. Her voice, when it came, was cold, the first words she had spoken all night. "He carries it too. He just doesn't know it yet." The cowboy's breath caught in his throat. Her tone was flat, without accusation or mercy, but the weight of it dropped on him like a hammer. He wanted to shout, to demand what she meant, but his voice refused to rise. Instead, he felt the sting of realization creeping in. Their fight was not just with the scarred figure. Somehow, in ways he couldn't yet see, He was part of it. The smirking sister's laugh was low, humorless. "He'll find out soon enough, maybe tonight." Her words crawled across the barn floor like smoke, curling into every shadow. The cowboy shifted his boots, fighting the urge to back away. There was nowhere to go. The barn door was shut, the sisters were a wall, and the figure's silence sealed him inside. The leader's voice struck again, sharp enough to cut through his thoughts. "You thought you could outrun us. You thought if you left it buried, it would die with time." Her eyes narrowed and her words cracked like a whip. "But we've been chasing truth longer than you've been hiding from it." The scarred figure finally drew a breath that rattled with weariness. "You don't understand what was taken," they said, voice low. "You don't know the price I paid." The sisters stiffened as though struck. One of them stepped forward. Fists clenched. "We know enough. We know blood spilled on that land. We know the fire that took our home wasn't an accident. We know who was there." Her eyes cut toward the cowboy for the briefest moment, and he felt the weight of suspicion settle on his shoulders. His chest tightened. Had his family name been tied to theirs? Had the trail he thought was his own been written long before? He ever set foot in this town? The idea churned in his gut like poison. The barn grew darker as the lantern flame guttered, shadows swallowing corners, pressing the circle tighter. The cowboy's pulse hammered in his ears, every sound amplified. The scrape of boots, the hiss of the horses, the creak of boards beneath shifting weight. The figure lifted their head at last, meeting the leader's stare. "If you take him," the figure said, nodding toward the cowboy, "you won't get what you want. You'll only find more grief." The words were soft, but they cracked like thunder in the still air. The sisters closed in tighter, 6 against 2, their boots moving in rhythm like a drumbeat of war. The cowboy felt trapped in the eye of a storm, unable to move, unable to speak, yet knowing that whatever happened next would change more than just this night. The prairie outside lay silent under the stars, but inside the barn, history itself seemed to tremble, waiting to break loose. He thought of the village just beyond, the saloon lamp still glowing faintly, the blacksmith's fire cooling in the forge, the preacher's bells silent against the sky. None of them knew what was unfolding here, how close their quiet lives were to being torn apart. One of the sisters, her voice softer than the rest but edged with steel, broke the silence. "It doesn't matter what he knows. He's part of it, same as you. And before this night is through, he'll stand on one side or the other." The cowboy's throat tightened. He wanted to shout that it wasn't his fight, that he didn't belong in their feud. But deep down, he knew the truth. The land tied everyone together, and bloodlines ran deeper than a man's wishes. He couldn't step out now, not with all eyes fixed on him. The figure's shadow stretched long across the straw as they took a single step forward, closer to the sisters. "Then let it end with me," they said. But the sisters didn't budge. Their leader's tone rose sharper, echoing off the beams. "It doesn't end until the truth is laid bare. Until every debt is paid." The cowboy's gut twisted. He had no idea what that truth was, but he knew he would be forced to hear it before long. And when it came, it wouldn't free him. It would bind him tighter. The horses whinnied sharply, hooves pounding against wood as if they too sensed the storm breaking. Dust swirled in the lantern glow, the flame shrinking low, shadows stretching tall. The sisters' boots beat in unison, the scarred figure stood braced, and the cowboy felt the weight of 1,000 unsaid words pressing down. Every heartbeat carried the question of who would move first, who would draw, who would break the silence and ignite the fire. And then, just as the tension threatened to snap, the barn door rattled again, louder this time, as though struck from outside. All eyes turned, the sisters' circle shifting but never breaking. The cowboy's breath caught in his chest. Whatever. Waited beyond that door had heard their storm, and it was coming in. The prairie night held its breath, the barn creaked beneath its weight, and the cowboy knew the moment had come. The past, the present, and everything they had buried was about to collide. The barn door shuddered again, harder than before, and then with a sharp crack it swung wide open. Cold night air rushed inside, sending the lantern flame bending sideways. For a moment, the cowboy thought it was another stranger stepping into their storm. But instead, the wind itself seemed to invade the room, carrying with it the sound of the prairie whistling through grass, rattling the dry branches outside, echoing through the silence that had held them bound. The sisters stiffened but didn't falter. The scarred figure didn't move. And the cowboy, standing between them all, felt the moment tipping toward its end. The leader of the sisters turned back toward the scarred figure, her eyes hard and unyielding. Yet her voice was quieter now, stripped of fire but heavy with truth. "We waited too long for this night," she said. "You owe us answers before we take another step." Her sisters stood in tight formation, their faces grim, shadows under their eyes revealing the toll of years spent chasing what had been stolen. They weren't about to walk away empty-handed. The figure took a long breath, shoulders sagging as though the weight of years had pressed down all at once. "You think I burned that land. You think I meant to drive you out." Their voice carried sorrow now, something raw and unguarded. "But the fire wasn't mine. I was there, yes. I fought. I tried to stop it. I couldn't." The words cracked, each one dragging out as if pulled from a wound that never healed. "And when it was done, I carried the blame because I was the only one left standing." The cowboy felt the barn tilt around him, his chest tightening. The sisters' leader's jaw clenched, her eyes bright with anger. "You expect us to believe that, after all this time?" The figure didn't flinch. "Believe what you will. But the truth is the same. Another hand struck that match. Another greed fed that flame. And the one who paid was me and you." They looked to the sisters, then to the cowboy, their eyes weary but firm. "All of you." The smirking sister spat into the straw, her voice bitter. "Words don't bring back what we lost. Words don't rebuild a home." The silent one stepped forward then, for the first time standing between her sisters and the figure. Her gaze swept over them, sharp as steel but softer than before. "Maybe words don't rebuild," she said, her tone steady, "but truth can. Stop us from burning more down." Her voice broke the circle. The sisters faltered, each of them stealing a glance at one another, unsure for the first time that night that the cowboy's heart pounded. He hadn't spoken, hadn't dared, but the silence pressed him now, demanding a voice. "If the fire was someone else's doing," he said slowly, the words rough in his throat, "then who? Who wanted you broken? Who wanted you scattered?" His question hung heavy in the rafters. The scarred figure's gaze flicked toward him, shadowed and grim. The same man who owned half the valley, who sent men to claim what wasn't his. He's long gone now, buried with his secrets, but his greed lit the fire. And I took the blame because someone had to. The sisters? Leader's face hardened, though a flicker of doubt crept in. She looked to the cowboy as if searching his face for the truth. The cowboy swallowed, his chest tight with the weight of it all. He had no stake in the past, yet somehow he was caught in the middle, bound by the land beneath his boots. And in that moment, he understood what the sisters had meant when they said he carried it too. The land wasn't just theirs or his, it tied all of them together. Its history, its scars, were shared whether he wanted them or not. The barn grew still again, but the air no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it held something fragile, like the first breath after a storm. The leader lowered her chin, her voice quieter but still sharp. "So you carried this lie all these years. You let us hunt shadows while you stood silent." The figure nodded once, slow. I thought silence would keep you safe. I was wrong. It only kept the wound open." The sisters shifted uneasily, the smirking one scowling, another staring at the floor, their unity shaken not by division but by the weight of truth pressing through their bond. The cowboy looked from face to face, then back to the figure. "So what now? The past can't be undone, but it can't keep bleeding forever." His words surprised even him. They weren't clever, but they felt true, and for the first time that night, the sisters' eyes turned toward him without hostility. The leader studied him for a long, heavy moment, then finally spoke. "Then we stop chasing ghosts, but we don't forget. We never forget." The figure lowered their head, relief flickering across their scarred face. "That's all I can ask." Their voice was tired, but it carried a note of release, like a weight finally shifted off their shoulders. The sisters drew back slightly, their circle loosening, not broken but no longer strangling. The tension in the barn eased, though the air still held the weight of years unspoken. The cowboy exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking as the storm inside the barn began to break apart. He thought of the village nearby, of the people who would wake tomorrow with no idea of what had nearly burned again in the dark. He thought of the charred ruins on the prairie and how now maybe they weren't just a scar to ride past but a story to carry, a warning not to be forgotten. The sisters had found what they came for, not vengeance, not blood, but truth. And the scarred figure, though burdened, had given them that truth at last. The lantern hissed softly, its flame small but steady, no longer fighting against the dark but glowing calm. The sisters gathered near the barn door, their leader pausing to cast one last look at the figure. Her voice was quiet but firm. "We walk out with our truth. Don't make us come back for more." The figure nodded, no argument left, only weary acceptance. One by one, the sisters stepped into the night, their boots echoing off the wood until they disappeared into the prairie's silence. The cowboy lingered, unsure if he should follow or stay. The figure turned to him, their expression worn but softer than before. "You didn't ask for this," they said, "but you'll carry it now, whether you like it or not. That's what it means to stand on this land. Its history sticks to you." The cowboy nodded slowly, the words sinking deep. He knew they were right. He had come here seeking quiet work, a simple life, but the land had given him a story instead, a story he couldn't walk away from. When he finally stepped out into the night, the stars stretched wide above him, endless and cold, yet strangely comforting. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying away the last echoes of the storm inside the barn. The sisters were gone, swallowed by the dark, but their presence lingered, strong as the horizon itself. The scarred figure remained behind, a shadow tethered to the barn, bound by years of silence but lighter now for having spoken. The cowboy stood alone under the vast sky, breathing deep. The night felt different, as though the land itself had shifted, released from the grip of secrets. He thought of the villagers who would rise with the sun, never knowing how close they had come to another fire. He thought of the sisters, bound not by revenge but by resilience. And he thought of himself, no longer just a wanderer passing through but part of a story older and heavier than his own. As the prairie wind carried the scent of earth and ash, the cowboy placed his hat low on his brow and started walking. He didn't know where the trail would lead, but he knew one thing with certainty: the land remembered, and so would he. And in that memory lay the strength to keep moving, one step at a time, into the wide and waiting dawn. Top of form, bottom of form.